Sometimes the things we think are worthless turn out to be our greatest blessings, and sometimes a single moment of kindness can change two lives forever. In a smoke-filled saloon on the Montana frontier, mountain man Caleb Stone won a young woman in a poker game. She was dirt-smudged and silent, and the whole room laughed as he led her into the night. They called her worthless. They said he'd been played for a fool. But when the sun rose over his struggling homestead, Caleb found her kneeling in the frozen soil, her hands moving through the earth with a tenderness he'd never seen. Within weeks, his barren land began to bloom like nothing in the territory. Who was this quiet woman, and what gift did she carry? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 days before that fateful poker game, Caleb Stone stood at the edge of his property and surveyed the land that had broken his back and his spirit for 7 long years. 160 acres of stubborn Montana soil stretched before him, rocky and resistant, yielding just enough to keep him alive, but never enough to let him truly live. The mountains rose behind his cabin like silent judges, their peaks still white with snow, even though it was late April. He was 45 years old, and some mornings he felt every single one of those years in his bones. The cabin he'd built with his own hands still stood solid, but it felt emptier with each passing season. Sarah had been gone for 7 years now, taken by childbirth complications that the traveling doctor couldn't fix. The baby, a son they'd planned to name Thomas, had followed her within hours. Caleb had buried them both on the small rise behind the cabin, under the cottonwood tree Sarah had loved. He visited their graves every Sunday, hat in hand, telling them about the week's struggles with the land, the port, weather, the loneliness that sat in his chest like a stone. He wasn't much for town, but every few weeks the isolation drove him down the mountain road to the settlement. It was barely a town, more a collection of buildings huddled together against the vastness of the territory. A general store, a blacksmith, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, and the Silver Creek Saloon, which served as the social center for every lonely man, drifter, and dreamer trying to make something of themselves in this harsh country. The saloon was where Caleb found himself that Saturday evening, nursing a whiskey and half listening to the usual talk of weather, cattle prices, and rumors from the territorial capital. The proprietor, Jack Sutton, kept a decent establishment, clean enough, honest enough, and the whiskey didn't make you blind. The poker tables in the back were where men with more hope than sense tried to change their fortunes, and Caleb usually stayed clear of them. But that night was different. That night, Thomas Dalton was holding court at the main table, and a crowd had gathered to watch. Dalton owned the largest ranch in the territory, 20,000 acres of prime grazing land that his father had claimed back in the 40s. He was a handsome man in his early 50s, silver threading through his dark hair, always dressed in fine clothes ordered from San Francisco. He played cards the way he ran his ranch aggressively and with absolute confidence in his right to win. Across from Dalton sat a drifter named Garrett, lean and dangerous-looking, with the kind of eyes that had seen too much and cared too little. He'd been in town for a week, doing odd jobs and drinking away his wages. Now he was at Dalton's table with a pile of coins that represented either a run of remarkable luck or remarkable foolishness. Caleb watched from the bar as the game intensified. Other players had folded out, leaving just Dalton and Garrett. The pot had grown substantial more money than Garrett likely possessed. The tension in the room thickened as Garrett studied his cards with increasing desperation. "I'm tapped out," Garrett finally said, his voice rough. "But I've got something worth more than money." Dalton's eyebrow raised. "I doubt that considerably, friend. This is a cash game." "I've got a woman," Garrett said. The room went quiet. "She's outside in my wagon, strong enough, young enough, worth at least what's in that pot." The words made Caleb's stomach turn. This was frontier country, rough and often lawless, but there were still lines that decent men didn't cross. Trading human beings like livestock was one of them, though it happened more often than anyone wanted to admit. Women, especially those without family or protection, could fall into circumstances where they became property in all but name. Jack Sutton started to object, but Dalton held up a hand. "Bring her in," he said. "Let's see what you're wagering." Garrett left and returned. A few minutes later, dragging a young woman by the arm. She stumbled as she entered, and the lamplight revealed someone who looked more like a shadow than a person. She was thin, her dress torn and dirty, her dark hair matted and hanging in her face. Her hands were bound loosely with rope, and she kept her eyes on the floor. She might have been 25 or 30, it was hard to tell under the dirt and exhaustion. The room buzzed with comments, most of them crude. Dalton looked her over with the same expression he might give a horse at auction. "She doesn't look like much," he said. "What makes you think she's worth this pot?" "She can work," Garrett said, "and she's quiet. Doesn't cause trouble. Worth her keep and then some." Caleb felt something stir in his chest, anger, pity, something that made him set down his whiskey glass harder than he intended. He'd seen enough cruelty in his life. He'd seen men treat animals better than this. Dalton seemed to consider it, then shook his head. "I've got no need for another ranch hand, particularly not one that looks half dead already. If you can't match the pot with coin, you fold." Garrett's face darkened. "Someone else, then? Anyone want to take this hand?" His eyes swept the room, challenging, desperate. The silence stretched. No one wanted to get involved. This was Garrett's problem, and the woman was likely more trouble than she was worth. Caleb felt every man in that room make the same calculation and come to the same conclusion. Walk away. Mind your own business. Don't get tangled up in someone else's mess. But Caleb couldn't stop looking at the woman. Something about the way she held herself, even in obvious fear and exhaustion, suggested a dignity that circumstances hadn't quite crushed. She reminded him painfully of a young deer he'd once found caught in a trap, terrified but not broken, waiting to see if the world would show mercy or cruelty. "I'll take the hand," Caleb heard himself say. Every head in the saloon turned toward him. Jack Sutton's expression showed surprise and concern. Thomas Dalton looked amused. Garrett's face split into a grin that had nothing kind in it. "Caleb Stone," Dalton said. "Didn't figure you for a gambling man." "I'm not," Caleb said, standing and walking to the table. "But I'll play this hand." He sat down across from Garrett, very aware of the woman standing nearby, still not looking up. Up close, he could see she was trembling slightly, though whether from cold, fear, or exhaustion, he couldn't tell. Garrett dealt the cards with quick, practiced movements. Caleb picked up his hand and looked at it without really seeing it. He wasn't thinking about poker strategy. He was thinking about Sarah, about the life they'd planned, about the kind of man he'd promised her he would be. The hand played out quickly. Caleb bet conservatively, and when the final cards were revealed, he had a pair of kings. Garrett had a pair of tens. It was enough. The room erupted in laughter and commentary. "Well, Stone," someone called out, "looks like you just won yourself the worst bargain in Montana." "Should have let Dalton take that hand," another voice added. "He's got money enough to throw away. What are you going to do with her?" Caleb ignored them. He stood and looked at Garrett. "The rope," he said quietly. Garrett untied the woman's hands with rough movements, then gathered what few coins he had left and headed for the door, muttering curses. The crowd began to disperse, the entertainment over, most of them placing bets on how long it would take Caleb to regret his decision. Caleb turned to the woman. She was looking at him now, her eyes dark and unreadable. "What's your name?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately. Her voice, when it came, was hoarse from disuse. "Does it matter?" "It does to me," Caleb said. She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether this was another trap or, possibly, impossibly, something else. "Eleanor," she finally whispered. "Eleanor," Caleb repeated. "I'm Caleb Stone. I've got a homestead up in the mountains. It's not much, but it's honest work, and you'll be safe there." That's all I'm offering, safety and honest work. You understand? She nodded slowly, still wary, still waiting for the cruelty she'd learned to expect. Then let's get you out of here, Caleb said. He took off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. It swallowed her small frame. We've got a fair ride ahead of us. They walked out of the Silver Creek saloon into the cold Montana night, leaving behind the laughter and the judgment. Caleb helped Eleanor onto his horse and climbed up behind her. She held herself stiff, separate, as if even this simple kindness might be a trick. As they rode up the mountain road under a sky full of stars, Caleb wondered what he'd just done. He'd acted on impulse, on some combination of decency and loneliness that he didn't fully understand. He had no idea who this woman really was, what she'd been through, or whether she'd even survive the night in her current condition. Behind him, Eleanor was silent, her body gradually relaxing slightly against the exhaustion that must have been overwhelming. When they finally reached his cabin an hour later, he helped her down and led her inside. He lit a lamp and gestured to the small bedroom that had once been meant for the child who never lived. "You can sleep there," he said. "There's a quilt on the bed. I'll be out here if you need anything." Eleanor looked around the simple cabin, clean, sparse, but solid and warm. Her eyes lingered on small details: the fireplace, the kitchen table, the bookshelf with its few well-worn volumes. Finally, she looked back at Caleb. "Why?" she asked simply. Caleb thought about how to answer that. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said finally. "And because I know what it's like to feel alone in this world." She nodded once, then slipped into the bedroom and closed the door. Caleb heard the creak of the bed as she lay down. He sat at his kitchen table for a long time, wondering what morning would bring, wondering if he'd just complicated his simple, lonely life beyond repair. He had no idea that the woman sleeping in his spare room carried knowledge that would transform not just his homestead, but his entire future. He had no idea that what he thought was an act of charity would become the greatest blessing of his life. All he knew was that for the first time in 7 years, his cabin didn't feel quite so empty. Caleb woke before dawn, as he always did. The cabin was cold, and he built up the fire before putting coffee on to boil. He moved quietly, aware that Eleanor was likely still sleeping after what must have been weeks or months of exhaustion and fear. He'd give her time. The chores could wait an hour or two. But when he glanced out the window as the first grey light touched the mountains, he saw her. She was kneeling in the field nearest the cabin, her hands pressed into the soil. For a moment, he thought something was wrong, that maybe she'd gotten confused or was in some kind of distress. He grabbed his coat and headed outside. The morning air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine from the mountains. His boots crunched on the frost-hardened ground as he approached her. She didn't look up, even though she must have heard him coming. Her focus was entirely on the earth before her, her fingers moving through the dirt with careful, deliberate movements. "Eleanor?" he said gently, not wanting to startle her. She looked up then, and he was struck by how different she appeared in the morning light. Her face was still dirty, her hair still tangled, but her eyes were alert and focused in a way they hadn't been the night before. There was intelligence there, and something else, a kind of hunger, but not for food. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, starting to stand. "I didn't mean to. I should have asked permission." "Permission for what?" Caleb asked, genuinely confused. She gestured at the ground around her. "To examine your soil. I woke up and saw the field, and I couldn't help myself. It's been so long since I—" She stopped, as if catching herself saying too much. Caleb looked at the earth she'd been studying. To him, it looked like it always did, rocky, stubborn, the same soil he'd been fighting for 7 years. "What about the soil?" he asked. Eleanor hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. When she spoke, her voice was different, more confident, more alive. "Your pH is too high. The soil is alkaline, which is why you're struggling with most crops. You can see it in the way the native plants grow, mostly sagebrush and rabbitbrush, both alkaline indicators. but the composition is actually quite good underneath. You've got decent clay content for moisture retention, and the mineral profile is better than you'd think from the surface. Appearance. Caleb stared at her. The words came out of her mouth like she was reading from a textbook, but with an ease that suggested deep familiarity. How do you know all that? She looked down at her hands, still covered in dirt. My father was a botanist, Professor Edmund Hartwell. He taught at the university in Philadelphia, but his real passion was fieldwork. He spent 20 years documenting plant species and soil conditions across the frontier territories. I traveled with him from the time I was 12. He taught me everything: plant identification, soil chemistry, cultivation techniques, seed propagation. It was our life together. The words tumbled out, like they'd been held back too long, like a dam finally breaking. Caleb listened, trying to reconcile this educated, knowledgeable woman with the silent, defeated figure he'd brought home last night. He died 6 months ago, Eleanor continued, her voice quieter now. Pneumonia, in a town with no proper doctor. After he was gone, I tried to continue his work, but a woman alone. She stopped, her jaw tightening. Men don't see a woman as a person with skills and knowledge. They see property, opportunity, something to be used. Caleb felt anger rise in his chest, not at her, but at the world that had reduced this remarkable person to a poker wager. Your father sounds like he was a wise man, he said carefully, to teach you all that. Eleanor looked up at him, searching his face for mockery or disbelief. Finding neither, she relaxed slightly. He used to say that knowledge was the only thing that couldn't be taken from you, but he was wrong about that. When everything else is taken, knowledge doesn't matter much. It matters now, Caleb said. If you can help this land produce, that matters a great deal. I've been working it for 7 years with barely enough yield to keep going. If there's something I'm doing wrong, I'd be grateful to learn. The transformation in Eleanor was remarkable. The 10 Anna wariness didn't disappear entirely, but it was joined by something else, purpose, maybe, or hope. She stood, brushing dirt from her hands. May I see what you've planted in the past? Caleb showed her around the property, explaining his attempts at crops, the failures with wheat, the moderate success with potatoes, the complete disaster with corn. Eleanor listened intently, occasionally stopping to examine the soil or look at the angle of the sun. She asked questions about drainage, about frost dates, about what grew wild in the surrounding forest. Finally, she turned to him. You've been fighting the land instead of working with it, she said, not unkindly. This soil wants to be amended. It wants different crops than you've been trying, and your planting arrangement, everything in straight rows with nothing else that's working against you. Plants help each other if you let them. Companion planting, my father called it. Some plants fix nitrogen in the soil, others repel pests that would destroy their neighbors. They're meant to grow in communities, not isolation. Caleb listened, fascinated despite himself. Can you do that here? Make them grow in communities? Eleanor reached into the pocket of her dress, the same torn, dirty dress she'd been wearing, though he'd have to find her something better, and pulled out a small leather pouch. She opened it carefully, revealing seeds. They were unusual varieties he didn't recognize, some small and dark, others larger and oddly shaped. My father collected seeds everywhere we traveled, she said, her voice reverent. Rare varieties, hardy strains, plants adapted to harsh conditions. He was creating a catalogue of species that could survive frontier life. These are all I have left of his work. I've been carrying them since he died, protecting them. She looked up at Caleb, and for the first time since he'd met her, there was something like hope in her expression. If you'll let me, I can plant these. I can show you techniques that will transform this land. It won't happen overnight, but within a season, maybe 2, you could have yields you've never imagined. Caleb looked at this woman, this unexpected gift that had come into his life through the ugliest of circumstances. He thought about his 7 years of loneliness and failure, about the way he'd been merely surviving rather than living. He thought about Sarah and the life they'd never got to build together, and about second chances that sometimes came disguised as disasters. "This is your home now, Eleanor," he said, "for as long as you want it to be. You don't need my permission to plant, but I'd be honored to learn from you, if you're willing to teach." Something in her face softened. The armor of wariness and self-protection, built up through months of horror, began to crack just a little. "Then we should start today," she said. "The growing season is short this far north. We don't have time to waste." They worked through the morning, Eleanor directing and Caleb following her instructions. She had him dig beds in patterns he'd never used before, creating circular arrangements instead of straight rows. She explained the reasoning behind every decision: this plant here, because it would provide shade for that one. This other plant, because its roots would break up the hard soil and make nutrients available to its neighbors. Her hands moved through the earth with a gentleness that was almost reverent. She placed each seed with care, pressing it into the soil at exactly the right depth, whispering information about what it needed to thrive. Caleb found himself moved by her dedication, by the way she seemed to pour all her remaining hope and energy into this simple act of planting. By midday, they'd prepared 3 large beds near the cabin. Eleanor had planted a complex arrangement of vegetables, herbs, and flowers that she promised would support and strengthen each other. She'd used perhaps a third of her precious seeds, treating each one like the treasure it was. As they stood looking at the freshly worked earth, Caleb felt something he hadn't felt in years: anticipation, a sense that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. "How long before we see results?" he asked. Eleanor smiled, just a little. It was the first time he'd seen her smile, and it transformed her face. "Some of these are fast-growing varieties my father developed. If the weather holds, you'll see shoots within a week. Within a month, you'll see real growth. By harvest time—" She paused, as if afraid to make too bold a promise. "By harvest time, you won't recognize this place." That afternoon, Caleb rode into town for supplies, leaving Eleanor at the homestead. He needed to get her proper clothes, more food, and some basic necessities. But he also needed time to process what was happening. In less than 24 hours, his entire world had shifted. The lonely mountain man, who'd been slowly giving up on life, now had a purpose again and a partner, however unexpected. At the general store, Mrs. Henderson was behind the counter. She was a stout woman in her 60s, the unofficial keeper of all the settlement's news and gossip. Her eyes widened when she saw him. "Caleb Stone," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone that meant she had questions. "Heard you won yourself a wife at the poker table last night." Word traveled fast in a small settlement. Caleb kept his expression neutral. "I helped someone who needed help, Martha. That's all." "Mrs. Henderson said, clearly not buying it. "And what are you planning to do with her?" "Give her a safe place to live and honest work," Caleb said firmly. "Same as I'd do for anyone in need." He purchased a dress, a coat, boots, and various necessities, trying to guess at Eleanor's size. Mrs. Henderson watched with sharp eyes but held her tongue, which was unusual for her. As Caleb was leaving, she called after him, "Caleb Stone, you're a good man, always have been. But folks are talking, and not all of it is kind. You be careful up there on that mountain. And if that girl needs anything woman things, you understand you send her to me. No woman should be alone without other women to help her." Caleb nodded, grateful for the unexpected offer of support. "I'll tell her." "Thank you, Martha." On the ride back up the mountain, Caleb thought about Mrs. Henderson's warning. People were talking. Of course they were. He'd done something unusual, something that would be interpreted in all sorts of ways, most of them wrong. But he'd learned long ago that you couldn't live your life based on what other people thought. You did what was right and dealt with the consequences. When he reached the homestead, he found Eleanor still in the fields. She'd continued working, preparing more beds, marking out areas for future planting. She was covered in dirt and sweat, but there was an energy about her that hadn't been there. That morning, she looked alive. "I brought you some things," Caleb said, handing her the packages. "They might not fit perfectly, but they're better than—" He gestured at her torn dress. Eleanor took the packages with hands that trembled slightly. "You didn't have to do this." "Yes, I did," Caleb said simply. "You're working hard. You deserve proper clothes and decent food. That's just basic human decency." That night, after Eleanor had washed and changed into the new dress, which actually fit reasonably well, they sat at the kitchen table for their first real meal together. Caleb had made a simple stew, nothing fancy, but Eleanor ate like it was a feast. They talked a little about the planting, about what else needed to be done, about the weather forecast for the coming weeks. As the evening deepened and the lamplight made the cabin feel warm and safe, Caleb realized something had fundamentally changed. For 7 years, this cabin had been a tomb, a place where he'd existed, but not lived, where he'd honored the memory of the dead, but forgotten about the needs of the living. Now, with Eleanor sitting across from him, planning and hoping and bringing knowledge and life to his barren acres, the cabin felt like a home again. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if they could truly make the land prosper, or what would come of this strange arrangement they'd fallen into. But for the first time since Sarah died, Caleb Stone felt something other than resignation. He felt possibility, and that, he thought, was worth more than all the gold in the Montana Territory. Outside, under the starlight, the seeds Eleanor had planted lay waiting in the earth, and though neither of them knew it yet, those seeds would change everything. 2 months into their partnership, and the homestead was unrecognizable. What had been Caleb's lonely struggle against stubborn earth had transformed into something remarkable. The fields produced vegetables in abundance: potatoes, carrots, beans, squash, all thriving in the mountain soil that had resisted cultivation for years. Eleanor's companion planting techniques worked exactly as she'd promised. Marigolds bordered the vegetable beds, their bright orange faces turning toward the sun, while their roots released compounds that kept pests away. Beans climbed poles next to corn stalks, fixing nitrogen in the soil. Squash leaves spread beneath them, shading the earth and retaining moisture, but it was the harvest itself that shocked everyone. When Caleb loaded his wagon with produce to sell in town, the sheer volume drew crowds. His potatoes were twice the size of his neighbors, his carrots were straight and sweet. His beans hung heavy on their vines. Word spread quickly, and soon other settlers were riding up the mountain with questions and pleas for advice. Eleanor never turned anyone away. She freely shared what she knew, explaining soil composition and pH levels, demonstrating proper composting techniques, gifting seeds from her precious supply. Caleb watched her teach a group of struggling farmers on a warm July afternoon, her hands gesturing as she explained crop rotation, her voice confident and clear. This was who she truly was. Not property, not a burden, but a teacher with knowledge that could change lives. Among the visitors, Eleanor noticed patterns that troubled her. Several families mentioned being pressured to sell their land. Others spoke of mysterious problems with their water rights or grazing permits. When pressed, most admitted the pressure came from Thomas Dalton or his representatives. He was systematically expanding his holdings, using legal maneuvering and economic pressure to acquire property from those who couldn't afford to resist. One evening, after a long day of teaching and working, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table with her father's journal. She'd been continuing his work, documenting everything they did on the homestead. Now she spread the pages before Caleb. "Look at this," she said, her voice tinged with excitement, and something else, a realization of significance. "My father wasn't just recording plant species. He was developing a complete system for frontier agriculture. Hardy varieties bred for harsh conditions, techniques for soil improvement without expensive fertilizers, methods for maximizing yield with minimal water. If this information were properly compiled and distributed, it could transform how people farm in the territories. Caleb looked at the detailed notes, the careful drawings, the decades of research. This is remarkable, Eleanor. Your father's life work, and mine now, Eleanor said. I want to finish what he started. Create a proper catalogue, a guidebook that any settler could use, prove that his theories work. She looked up at Caleb, her eyes bright. We're the proof. This homestead is living evidence that his methods succeed where traditional farming fails. Then we'll finish. It, Caleb said. Document everything. Make it scientific and thorough. Your father's name should be remembered for this work. Eleanor reached across the table and took his hand. In the 2 months since that first morning when she'd examined his soil, their relationship had evolved into something neither had expected. They worked side by side from dawn to dusk. They shared meals and conversations. They laughed together at small moments of joy. A particularly large potato, a rabbit that kept stealing beans, the way the sunset painted the mountains. Trust had grown between them, and with it, something deeper. I don't know what I would have done without you, Eleanor said softly. You saved my life, Caleb, and then you gave me a reason to live it. Before Caleb could respond, they heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. It was late for visitors, nearly dusk. Caleb stood, his hand automatically moving to the rifle that hung near the door. But it was just one rider, and as the figure came into view, he recognized Mr. Paulson from the settlement. Caleb, Eleanor, Paulson called out, dismounting quickly. I've got news. Thomas Dalton has made an official offer. He wants to hire Eleanor as an agricultural consultant for his ranch. Sent a formal letter to the settlement postmaster, offering substantial money and what he calls proper professional arrangements. Eleanor's face went pale. I already refused him. Well, he's not taking no for an answer, Paulson said. He's been asking around, finding out about Eleanor's background. Somehow, he learned about her father, about the professor's reputation. He's telling everyone that knowledge like that shouldn't be wasted on a small homestead, that it should be properly utilized for the benefit of the territory. He means for his benefit, Caleb said, anger rising in his chest. He wants to control what Eleanor knows, use it for his own profit. That's the sense I got too, Paulson agreed. But he's got influence, Caleb. The territorial governor listens to him. He's making it sound like he's concerned for Eleanor's welfare, like she's being kept in poor conditions here. He looked apologetic. Some people are starting to listen. After Paulson left with promises to keep them informed, Caleb and Eleanor sat in heavy silence. Finally, Eleanor spoke. He won't stop, will he? He sees me as property to be acquired, just like Garrett did. Just dressed up in fancier words about professional opportunities and proper utilization. I won't let him take you, Caleb said firmly. This is your home. You choose to be here. But what if he finds a way? Eleanor's voice was small, frightened in a way Caleb hadn't heard since that first night. What if he uses the law, uses his influence? I have no legal standing, Caleb. I'm nobody. A drifter's former property. Who's going to listen to what I want? Caleb crossed to her, kneeling beside her chair so he could look into her eyes. You're not nobody. You're Eleanor Hartwell, daughter of one of the most respected botanists in the country. You're a scientist in your own right. And he paused, then committed to the truth. You're the person who brought my life back from the dead, who made me remember what it means to hope for tomorrow. You matter, Eleanor. To this community, to this land, and to me. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. I'm afraid, Caleb. I'm afraid he'll find a way to take me away from here, from you. I've finally found a place where I belong, and I can't lose it. Then we make sure you can't be taken, Caleb said. He stood, made his decision. Marry me. Not in 2 weeks when the preacher comes, but now, tonight. There's a justice of the peace in Silver Creek, just an hour's ride. We go there now, make it legal and binding. As my wife, you have legal protection. Dalton can't claim you're being held improperly. He can't argue you're just a vagrant without standing. You'd be Eleanor Stone, legal, resident, and property owner. Eleanor stared at him. Are you sure? This is fast. And it's not romantic, doing it this way. Romance is for young people with time to waste, Caleb said gently. We're past that. What we have is better partnership, respect, shared purpose. That's worth more than romance ever was. And right now, making it legal is the smart thing to do. The right thing. Eleanor stood, wiping her eyes. Then yes, let's do it now. Tonight. They rode through the gathering darkness to Silver Creek, a smaller settlement about 10 miles east. The justice of the peace, a practical man named Morrison, married them in his parlor with his wife as witness. There were no flowers, no fancy dress, no celebration, just two people standing before the law and each other, speaking vows that meant safety, partnership, and commitment. When Morrison pronounced them married, Caleb took Eleanor's hand and slipped a simple gold band onto her finger. He'd bought it that afternoon in town, somehow knowing this moment would come. It wasn't fancy, just a plain circle of gold, but Eleanor looked at it like it was the most precious thing she'd ever received. Thank you, she whispered, for seeing me, for protecting me, for giving me a home. Thank you, Caleb replied, for bringing life back to my land and my heart. They rode back to the homestead under a sky full of stars. When they arrived, Caleb carried Eleanor over the threshold, honoring the tradition even in their unconventional circumstances. She laughed, really laughed, for the first time since Dalton's offer had cast its shadow over them. That night, in the cabin that was now legally theirs together, they sat and talked for hours. They spoke of plans for the land, for the catalogue they would complete, for the future they would build. And when Eleanor finally retired to what had been the spare room, she paused at the door. This doesn't have to be separate anymore, she said quietly. We're married, truly married. Caleb crossed to her, cupped her face gently in his calloused hands. We'll take this at your pace. There's no rush. What matters is that you're safe, that you're home, that you're mine in the eyes of the law so no one can take you away. Eleanor smiled and kissed him, tender and brief but full of promise. Good night, husband. Good night, wife. As Caleb lay in his bed that night, he thought about the strange path that had brought them here. A reckless poker game. A woman everyone called worthless, seeds planted in stubborn soil. And now, a marriage that made sense in ways he couldn't fully articulate but felt deeply true. The seeds Eleanor had planted were thriving. And so, against all odds, was the love growing between them, quiet, practical, and absolutely real. The morning after their quiet wedding, Eleanor woke to find Caleb already up, working in the kitchen. The smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the cabin. She emerged from her room. Their arrangement hadn't changed overnight, though something felt different in the air between them. There was a new certainty, a solidness that came from legal commitment. Good morning, Mrs. Stone, Caleb said with a slight smile. Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest. Good morning, Mr. Stone. They decided to have a proper ceremony when the circuit preacher came through, something public that would make their union known to the community. Mrs. Henderson, delighted by the news, threw herself into organizing a modest celebration. She enlisted the help of the other women, and despite Eleanor's protests that it wasn't necessary, preparations began in earnest. 2 weeks later, on a clear Sunday morning, people gathered at the small church in the settlement. Eleanor wore a simple dress that Mrs. Henderson and the other women had sewn together, pale blue cotton with delicate white embroidery at the collar and cuffs. Caleb wore his father's suit, cleaned and mended, looking uncomfortable but dignified. The traveling preacher, Reverend Matthews, was a kind man in his 60s who'd been serving the circuit for 30 years. He'd married Caleb and Sarah years ago, and he remembered. Before the ceremony, he spoke privately with Caleb. Sarah was a fine woman, Matthews said. and she'd want you to be happy. Don't carry guilt for choosing to live again. The ceremony was simple, but heartfelt. Caleb and Eleanor stood before their community and repeated vows they'd already spoken once before, but this time with witnesses, with blessing, with the support of people who'd come to care for them. When Caleb lifted Eleanor's hand and saw the gold band already there, he smiled. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the small church erupted in genuine celebration. The gathering afterward, held in the churchyard, was modest but warm. Women had brought food, pies, breads, preserves. Men had contributed what they could. It wasn't fancy, but it was given with generosity and genuine goodwill. Eleanor found herself surrounded by women who'd become friends, and the realization brought tears to her eyes. "You're one of us now, Mrs. Henderson said, squeezing Eleanor's hand. "Properly and officially. And don't think we don't know what you've done for this community. Half the gardens in the settlement are thriving because of what you've taught us." Even the men, initially skeptical of the poker bride, had come around. Mr. Paulson raised a toast. "To Caleb and Eleanor Stone, may their land be as fruitful as their partnership." The only shadow on the day was Thomas Dalton's absence, not because anyone wanted him there, but because his absence felt pointed, deliberate. He was making a statement by not acknowledging their marriage, but Eleanor refused to let him darken their celebration. This was her day, her choice, her life. As evening fell and guests began departing, Caleb and Eleanor rode back up the mountain together. The setting sun painted everything gold and pink, and the fields they'd worked together spread before them, green and abundant. "Happy?" Caleb asked. "More than I ever thought possible," Eleanor replied honestly. 3 months ago I had nothing, no family, no home, no future. Now I have all of that." That night marked a turning point in their relationship. They'd been married in law, and now in the eyes of their community. The tentative partnership evolved into something deeper. Eleanor moved her belongings into Caleb's room, and they began their life together as true husband and wife, not just in name, but in practice. The weeks that followed were perhaps the happiest either had known. They fell into an easy rhythm of working the land by day and working on the catalogue by night. Eleanor taught Caleb to understand the botanical Latin in her father's notes. He taught her to shoot more accurately, to track game, to read weather signs in the mountains. They were building not just a homestead but a true partnership of equals. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge, Eleanor spoke of the future. "I've been thinking about children," she said softly. "I know you lost. I know what happened with Sarah, and I don't want to push, but I wondered if you'd ever want to try again." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. The loss of his son still ached, would always ache. But looking at Eleanor, at the life they'd built together, he felt something he hadn't felt in 7 years, hope that maybe, possibly, he could have that joy without the crushing fear. "I'd like that," he said finally. "Not right away, maybe, but someday. I think I'm ready to hope for that again." Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder. Someday sounds perfect, but their peaceful existence was about to be disrupted. A few days later, Mr. Paulson rode up the mountain again, this time with news that made Caleb's blood run cold. "Dalton's been asking questions," Paulson said. "About Eleanor's background, about her father, about how she came to be in Garrett's possession. He's been sending telegrams back east, trying to dig up information. And he's been meeting with the territorial judge, making some kind of case." "What kind of case?" Eleanor asked, her face pale. "I don't know exactly," Paulson admitted. "But he's not letting this go. He wants access to what you know, Eleanor. And he's the kind of man who gets what he wants, one way or another." After Paulson left, Caleb held Eleanor as she trembled with fear and anger. "I won't let him take you," he promised. "Whatever he's planning, we'll face it together." But even as he spoke the words, Caleb felt unease settle in his gut. Dalton had money, influence, and connections that reached all the way to the territorial capital. What did they have? A small homestead, some thriving plants, and the goodwill of a few settlers. Would that be enough? Eleanor seemed to read his thoughts. We have the truth, she said firmly. We have my father's research and the proof that his methods work. We have a legal marriage and a legitimate claim to this land. That has to count for something. It does, Caleb agreed, but we need to be prepared for whatever Dalton throws at us. We need to have all our documentation in order, all our legal standing clear and unquestionable. They spent the next few days organizing papers, Eleanor's father's will, their marriage certificate, proof of Caleb's land claim, documentation of their agricultural success. They made copies and stored them in different locations. They asked Reverend Matthews to attest to the legitimacy of their marriage. They did everything they could to protect what they'd built. But as autumn approached and the first harvest came in yields that exceeded even Eleanor's optimistic projections, the tension hung over them like a storm cloud. Dalton hadn't made his move yet, but they knew it was coming. The question was when and how, and whether they'd be strong enough to survive it. The seeds Eleanor had planted had grown into abundance beyond anyone's dreams. But abundance attracted attention, and attention from powerful men was dangerous. Their peaceful summer was ending, and the real test of their partnership was about to begin. The storm broke on a crisp October morning when the territorial judge arrived in the settlement with an official delegation. Caleb and Eleanor were in town selling their harvest produce when they heard the news. Judge Blackwood had come all the way from the capital, and he'd come at Thomas Dalton's request. The judge set up in the settlement hall, a building that served as courthouse, meeting place, and social center. Word spread quickly, and by noon, most of the settlement had gathered to see what this was about. Caleb and Eleanor entered the hall hand in hand, their hearts pounding, but their faces calm. Judge Blackwood was an imposing man in his 50s, with steel-gray hair and the kind of face that suggested he'd seen every trick and scheme humanity had to offer. He sat at a table at the front of the hall, papers spread before him. Thomas Dalton sat beside him, looking confident and somehow righteous. "Mr. and Mrs. Stone," the judge said, his voice carrying through the hall. "Thank you for coming. We have a legal matter to discuss that concerns your marriage and Mrs. Stone's status." "Our marriage is legal and properly documented," Caleb said firmly. "We have nothing to answer for." "That may be," the judge said, "but Mr. Dalton has brought some troubling information to my attention." He gestured to Dalton, who stood with the air of a man about to deliver a winning hand. "Your Honor," Dalton began, his voice smooth and reasonable. "I've done some research into Mrs. Stone's background and the circumstances by which she came to be in this territory. I've discovered information that suggests the poker game by which Mr. Stone acquired her was not the first transaction involving her person." Eleanor's hand tightened in Caleb's. "What are you talking about?" Dalton produced a set of documents. "I have here a bill of sale dated 2 weeks before the poker game in question. It shows that a woman matching Mrs. Stone's description was sold to me by the same drifter, Garrett, for the sum of $200. The transaction was witnessed and notarized in Silver Creek." The hall erupted in murmurs. Caleb felt the floor shift beneath him. "That's impossible. Eleanor was never Dalton's property." "These documents suggest otherwise," the judge said, examining the papers Dalton had provided. "They appear legitimate, properly signed, witnessed, and notarized." Eleanor's face had gone white. "Those are forgeries. I was never sold to Dalton. Garrett had me for less than a month before the poker game. He couldn't have sold me to Dalton 2 weeks prior." "The documents tell a different story," Dalton said, his voice full of false concern. "According to these records, I purchased you from Garrett with the intention of employing you as an agricultural consultant. Before I could take possession, however, Garrett absconded with you and subsequently wagered you in a card game with Mr. Stone. Essentially, Stone won property that was already legally mine." The logic was twisted but clever. Caleb could see Judge Blackwood considering it, weighing the documents against their protests. "These are lies," Caleb said, his voice hard. Dalton forged those documents because he wants Eleanor's knowledge for himself. That's a serious accusation, the judge said. Do you have proof of forgery? Do we have proof? Caleb felt frustration and fear rising. The proof is that it never happened. Eleanor can testify to the truth, and Mr. Stone would naturally have his wife testify in his favor. Dalton interjected smoothly. Your Honor, I'm not seeking to destroy anyone's happiness. I'm simply asking for what's legally mine. If Mrs. Stone was indeed my property first, then Stone's subsequent acquisition was invalid. I'm willing to be generous. I'll pay Mr. Stone what he paid for her, which I believe was nothing more than a poker hand. And then Mrs. Stone can come work for me, as was originally intended, under proper conditions, with fair compensation. Eleanor found her voice, and it rang clear and strong through the hall. I'm not property to be bought and sold. I am Eleanor Hartwell, daughter of Professor Edmund Hartwell of Philadelphia. My father died 6 months ago, leaving me alone and vulnerable. I fell into the hands of men who treated me as less than human, but that doesn't make their actions legal or their claims valid. She pulled documents from her bag, her father's will, papers proving her identity, newspaper clippings about Professor Hartwell's death. These prove who I am. I have never been anyone's property to sell. What Garrett did was kidnapping. What Dalton is attempting now is the same crime, dressed in legal language. The judge examined her documents with growing interest. These appear authentic, he said. If you are indeed Professor Hartwell's daughter, you would have had legal standing as a free citizen. The transactions involving you would be void. Which is why I have additional documentation, Dalton said, producing more papers. I have here affidavits from Garrett stating that Miss Hartwell came to him voluntarily, seeking employment and transportation. He claims she indentured herself to him in exchange for passage and protection. The subsequent sale to me was a legal transfer of that indenture contract. That's a lie. Eleanor's voice shook with rage. Garrett and 2 other men ambushed our camp after my father died. They stole everything we had and dragged me away. I never signed anything, never agreed to anything. Do you have witnesses to this alleged kidnapping? The judge asked. Eleanor's face fell. My father was dead. We were alone in the wilderness. There were no witnesses except the men who took me. The judge sighed. This is complicated. We have competing claims, documents that may or may not be authentic, and no way to verify the testimony of the primary witness, this Garrett fellow who has conveniently disappeared. Conveniently indeed, Caleb said, probably because Dalton paid him to disappear after forging these documents. Again, a serious accusation without proof, Dalton said. Your Honor, I propose a solution. Let the matter go to the territorial capital for full adjudication. In the meantime, Mrs. Stone should be placed in protective custody to ensure her safety and well-being while the case is decided. Protective custody? Eleanor's voice rose. You mean your custody? You mean taking me away from my husband and my home and forcing me to work for you while you tie this up in legal proceedings that could take months or years? The judge looked uncomfortable. Mrs. Stone's concerns are valid. However, if there's a legitimate question about the legality of her marriage to Mr. Stone, we do need to ensure proper oversight. The hall erupted in protests. Mrs. Henderson stood up, her voice cutting through the noise. Judge Blackwood, this is ridiculous. Eleanor Stone has been living in our community for months. She's proven herself to be a woman of character and knowledge. She's freely chosen to marry Caleb Stone, and their marriage is recognized by our church and our community. You can't just take her away based on some convenient paperwork Thomas Dalton produces. Other voices joined hers. Mr. Paulson stood. Dalton's been trying to acquire Eleanor's knowledge since he first learned about her. This is just another attempt to get what he wants through legal manipulation. The schoolteacher's wife, Mrs. Paulson, added her voice. We've seen how Dalton operates. He's forced out 3 families in the last year through similar legal maneuvering. This is the same pattern. Judge Blackwood held up his hand for silence. I understand there are strong feelings here, but the law is the law, and these documents require proper investigation. I'm ordering that this case be transferred to the territorial capital for full hearing. In the meantime, she's my wife, legally married before witnesses and clergy. You can't take her based on forged documents and the word of a man who's disappeared. The judge's expression hardened. Mr. Stone, I understand your position, but I'm also aware that you have limited means and influence, while Mr. Dalton has considerable resources and standing in this territory. If this case goes forward and you're found to have been harboring property that legally belonged to another property, Eleanor's voice cut through like a knife. I am not property. I am a human being with rights and agency. My father was a respected scientist. I have education, knowledge, skills. I chose to marry Caleb Stone. That choice is mine to make, and no amount of forged paperwork changes that. She pulled one more document from her bag, a prestigious medal her father had received from the Philadelphia Academy of Sciences. This was my father's. It proves his standing and, by extension, mine. I am Eleanor Hartwell Stone, free citizen and scientist in my own right, and I will not be treated as property by Thomas Dalton or anyone else. The judge examined the medal, clearly impressed despite himself. The tension in the hall was thick enough to cut. Finally, Dalton spoke, and his voice had lost some of its smooth confidence. Your Honor, perhaps we can reach a compromise. Allow Mrs. Stone to remain with her husband for now, but schedule a hearing in 30 days at the territorial capital. Both parties can present their evidence, and a final determination can be made. Surely that's reasonable. But his eyes, when they met Eleanor's, were cold and calculating, and Eleanor understood with sudden clarity this wasn't over. Dalton would use those 30 days to manufacture more evidence, to pressure officials, to build an unassailable legal case. He was playing a long game, and he was very good at it. The judge agreed to the compromise, setting a hearing date 30 days hence. As the hall emptied, Caleb and Eleanor stood together, surrounded by supportive neighbors but feeling the weight of what was coming. We have 30 days, Eleanor said quietly. 30 days to prove the documents are forged, to build our case, to find a way to beat him. Then we'll use every minute of them, Caleb replied. But his hand on her shoulder trembled slightly, betraying the fear he wouldn't voice. They'd just discovered that their peaceful life could be taken away by a powerful man with forged papers and legal manipulation. The question was whether they were strong enough and clever enough to fight back. The 30 days passed in a blur of desperate preparation. Caleb and Eleanor worked with a focused intensity, trying to build a case that could stand against Dalton's money and influence. But the odds felt insurmountable. Dalton had the territorial governor's ear, connections throughout the legal system, and seemingly unlimited resources to manufacture whatever evidence he needed. Eleanor threw herself into completing her father's catalogue with renewed urgency. If she was going to be taken away, she wanted to leave something behind, a complete record of everything her father had discovered and everything she'd learned. She worked late into every night, documenting planting techniques, soil compositions, seed varieties, and cultivation methods. Her handwriting filled page after page, creating a comprehensive guide that any settler could follow. Caleb watched her work herself to exhaustion, driven by fear and determination in equal measure. He tried to help however he could, but he felt helpless against the legal machinery Dalton had set in motion. What did a simple mountain man know about courts and judges and legal proceedings? His weapons were honesty and hard work, and those seemed pitifully inadequate against Dalton's calculated manipulation. 2 weeks before the hearing, Caleb made a decision. He would return to the settlement and try to find evidence of Dalton's forgeries. Someone had to have witnessed the creation of those false documents. Someone had to know something that could help them. I don't want you to go alone, Eleanor said when he told her his plan. What if something happens? I'll be careful. Caleb promised, "but we need something more than our word against his documents. I have to try." The night before he left, they lay together in the darkness, holding each other close. Eleanor traced the scar on Caleb's shoulder, an old injury from his army days, and spoke softly. "If they take me away, if Dalton wins, don't talk like that." Caleb interrupted. "No, listen," Eleanor insisted. "If that happens, I need you to know that these months with you have been the happiest of my life. You gave me back my purpose, my dignity, my hope. Whatever happens, that's something no one can take away." Caleb pulled her closer. "I'm not losing you. I lost Sarah, lost my son. I won't lose you too. Whatever I have to do, whatever it costs, I'll keep you safe." "Promise me something," Eleanor whispered. "Promise that you'll finish the catalogue if I can't. Make sure my father's work survives. Make sure other people can benefit from what he learned. That matters more than anything." "I promise," Caleb said, though the words felt like ash in his mouth. "But it won't come to that. We'll win this." The next morning, Caleb rode down the mountain into uncertain danger. He spent 2 days in the settlement and surrounding areas, talking to anyone who might have information. He learned that Garrett had indeed left the territory paid off handsomely by someone, according to rumors. He learned that the notary who'd supposedly witnessed the documents was new to the area, hired by Dalton just weeks before the supposed transaction. He learned that 2 other families Dalton had forced out had similar stories of convenient paperwork appearing at crucial moments, but learning and proving were different things. Everyone was afraid to speak against Dalton officially. He held mortgages, controlled water rights, had the power to destroy anyone who opposed him. Whispered suspicions weren't evidence that would hold up in court. On his 3rd night away, Caleb made a desperate decision. He would break into Dalton's ranch office and search for proof of the forgeries. It was illegal, possibly dangerous, but he was out of options. He waited until well after midnight, then approached Dalton's sprawling ranch house from the back. The office was in a separate building, easier to access without alerting the main house. He picked the lock, a skill learned in his army. Days and slipped inside. Moonlight through the windows provided enough light to see. He searched through files and ledgers, looking for anything that might prove the forgeries or show a pattern of similar manipulations. What he found was worse than he'd imagined. Dalton had files on dozens of homesteaders. He'd been systematically identifying valuable properties and the vulnerabilities of their owners. For some, it was debt he could leverage. For others, it was legal complications he could exploit. For 3 families, including one Caleb recognized, there were notes about document preparation, with dates that preceded the supposed legal actions. This was a pattern, a business model built on corruption and coercion. Caleb was photographing pages with a small camera he'd borrowed, hoping the images might serve as evidence when he heard voices outside. His heart hammered as he realized Dalton's men were approaching the office. He'd been discovered. He managed to slip the camera into his jacket and was backing toward a window when the door burst open. 3 of Dalton's hired men entered, and Caleb recognized them as the kind of rough characters who do anything for money. A fight was inevitable. Caleb had been a soldier and a scout. He knew how to fight, and he fought now with desperate strength. But 3 against 1, with limited space to maneuver, the odds weren't in his favor. He managed to get 2 of them down, but the 3rd landed a heavy blow to his ribs with a club. Caleb felt something crack, pain exploding through his side. He fought through the pain, managed to break free, and dove through the window in a shower of breaking glass. He rolled, came up running despite the fire in his ribs, and made it to his horse. Shots rang out behind him, but he was already riding hard into the darkness, bent low over the horse's neck. He rode through the night, every breath agony from his broken ribs. Blood from various cuts soaked his shirt. But he had the camera. He had the evidence. If he could just make it home, maybe they had a chance. Dawn was breaking when he finally reached the homestead. Eleanor was already up, working in the fields despite the early hour. When she saw him riding in, injured and bloody, she dropped her tools and ran to him. "Caleb, what happened?" He dismounted with a groan, nearly falling. Eleanor caught him, helped him into the cabin. As she cleaned his wounds and bound his ribs broken but not dangerously so, he told her everything. About Dalton's files, the pattern of corruption, the evidence he'd managed to photograph. "We have proof now," he said through gritted teeth. "Not just about your case, but about everything he's done. If we can get this to the right people, if we can survive long enough to present it," Eleanor said grimly. "Caleb, you broke into his property. You stole documents. He could have you arrested." "It was worth the risk," Caleb insisted, but he knew she was right. They'd escalated the situation, and Dalton wouldn't let this go unanswered. They didn't have to wait long. That afternoon, riders appeared on the ridge, 6 of Dalton's men, heavily armed. But they didn't approach the homestead. They just sat there, watching. A clear message. They were surrounded, monitored, trapped. Eleanor stood on the porch, looking at the distant riders, and felt fear turn to anger. "He's trying to intimidate us, to make us feel helpless." "It's working," Caleb admitted, one hand pressed to his bandaged ribs. But that evening brought an unexpected turn. As the sun was setting, more riders approached, but these weren't Dalton's men. Mrs. Henderson led a group of women from the settlement, their wagon loaded with supplies. Behind them came Mr. Paulson and several other farmers, all armed. Mrs. Henderson climbed down from the wagon with the authority of a general commanding troops. "We heard about the trouble. Thought you might could use some support. Martha, you shouldn't be here," Caleb said. "Dalton's men are watching. You could be putting yourselves at risk." "Let them watch," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "We're not leaving you to face this alone. Eleanor's one of ours, and we protect our own." The women set about making camp, preparing food, and organizing a rotation of watchers. The men positioned themselves strategically around the property. What had been an isolated homestead under surveillance became a fortified community gathering. Dalton's men, seeing the numbers growing, withdrew to a more distant position. That night, gathered around a fire, the community held council. Mr. Paulson had news. "I sent word to the territorial marshal, the federal one, not the local one Dalton has in his pocket. Told him about the pattern of land theft, the families forced out, everything. He's interested. Says if there's evidence of systematic corruption, it falls under federal jurisdiction." "We have evidence," Caleb said, showing the camera and explaining what he'd found. "But I obtained it illegally. Will it even be admissible?" "That's for the marshal to figure out," Paulson replied. "Point is, Dalton's not operating in the shadows anymore. People are watching, people are talking, and the federal government doesn't like territorial corruption that makes it look bad." Eleanor felt hope stir for the first time in days. "So we have a chance?" "We have more than a chance, Mrs. Henderson said. "We have each other, and that's worth more than all of Dalton's money and influence." Over the next few days, more families arrived to show support. The homestead became a symbol of resistance against Dalton's systematic oppression. Stories emerged of other families he'd wronged, other properties he'd stolen through legal manipulation. What had started as one man's attempt to possess one woman's knowledge had exposed a much larger pattern of corruption. The territorial marshal arrived 5 days before the scheduled hearing. He was a lean, weathered man in his 50s named Clayton, with eyes that missed nothing. He interviewed Caleb and Eleanor, examined the evidence, and talked to the families Dalton had wronged. He reviewed the forged documents with a handwriting expert he'd brought along. "These are definitely forgeries," the expert confirmed. "Different ink composition from the claimed date, paper stock that didn't exist 2 months ago, signature inconsistencies. Whoever made these was good, but not good enough." Marshal Clayton looked at Eleanor with respect. Mrs. Stone, you and your husband have done the territory a service. Dalton's been operating this scheme for at least 3 years, but no one had the courage or evidence to challenge him. You've given us both. So what happens now? Eleanor asked. Now we go to that hearing, Clayton said. But it's not going to be what Dalton expects. Instead of defending yourselves, you're going to watch me arrest him for fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. And then we're going to dismantle his entire operation and return property to the people he's wronged. Caleb felt something release in his chest, the tension he'd been carrying for weeks. They'd done it. Against impossible odds, they'd found a way to fight back and win. But Eleanor's expression was still troubled. Dalton's not going to go quietly. He has too much to lose. Men like him don't surrender peacefully. She was right. The final confrontation was still to come, and it would be more dangerous than any of them anticipated. But for now, they had hope, they had evidence, and they had a community standing with them. The seeds Eleanor had planted had grown into more than just crops. They'd grown into solidarity, resistance, and the courage to stand against injustice. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The doctor's office was 3 buildings down from the courthouse. Caleb was carried there by deputies, while Eleanor held pressure on his wound, her hands steady despite her fear. The bullet had gone through the meat of his shoulder, missing bone and major blood vessels. Painful but not fatal, the doctor confirmed after a quick examination. You're lucky, the doctor said as he cleaned and bandaged the wound. An inch to the right, and we'd be having a different conversation. Not luck, Caleb said, looking at Eleanor. Purpose. I had something worth protecting. Back at the courthouse, Dalton was in chains, his men disarmed and arrested. The veneer of respectability he'd maintained for years was completely shattered. In trying to shoot Eleanor, he'd proved everything they'd accused him of, that he saw her as property to be controlled or destroyed, that he was willing to use violence to get what he wanted, that he valued power over law. Marshal Clayton conducted his business with efficient authority. Dalton was formally charged with attempted murder in addition to the fraud and forgery charges. His lawyer, seeing how badly things had turned, quietly distanced himself from the case. Other officials who'd been in Dalton's pocket suddenly found urgent business elsewhere. By afternoon, Caleb was bandaged and mobile, his arm in a sling. He and Eleanor returned to the courthouse for the final proceedings. Judge Blackwood, looking shaken by the violence that had erupted in his courtroom, addressed the assembly. This court acknowledges that the documents presented by Thomas Dalton regarding Eleanor Stone were fraudulent. The marriage between Caleb Stone and Eleanor Hartwell Stone is legitimate and legal. Mrs. Stone is a free citizen with full rights and privileges. Furthermore, this court recognizes the broader pattern of corruption and fraud perpetrated by Mr. Dalton and orders a full investigation into all land transactions he's been involved with over the past 5 years. He looked at Eleanor with something like respect. Mrs. Stone, I apologize that you were subjected to this ordeal. You've conducted yourself with remarkable dignity and courage. Eleanor stood, still holding Caleb's good hand. Thank you, Your Honor, but I'm not the only victim here. There are families throughout this territory who've lost their land and livelihoods to Dalton's schemes. I hope justice extends to them as well. It will, Marshal Clayton assured her. We'll be conducting a thorough review. Any families with evidence of fraud or coercion should come forward. Properties taken illegally will be returned. Over the next few hours, people began coming forward with their stories. Families who'd been too afraid to speak out now found courage in Eleanor's example. The scope of Dalton's corruption became clear. Dozens of properties acquired through fraudulent documents, intimidation, and legal manipulation. He'd built an empire on other people's suffering, and that empire was now crumbling. As the sun set, Caleb and Eleanor finally left the courthouse. They were exhausted, drained by the day's events, but also profoundly relieved. It was over. Really, truly over. Dalton was going to prison. His forged claims were nullified. Their marriage was secure. Mrs. Henderson was waiting outside with the other women who'd come to support them. "Well," she said with satisfaction, "that's that. Now, let's get you two home. You've had quite enough excitement for one day." They stayed overnight in the capital at a modest boarding house. The proprietor, hearing who they were and what had happened, refused payment. "You stood up to corruption," she said. "That takes courage. Your money's no good here." That night, in their rented room, Eleanor helped Caleb change his bandages. Her hands were gentle as she cleaned the wound and applied the salve the doctor had provided. "You took a bullet for me," she said softly. "You could have been killed." "So could you," Caleb replied. "That's what he intended. I wasn't going to let that happen." Eleanor looked at him. This man who'd won her in a poker game and given her back her life. "I love you," she said. It was the first time either of them had spoken those words. "Not because you saved me, though you did. Not because you gave me a home, though you did that too. I love you because you see me. You respect me. You treat me as an equal partner in everything we do. That's rarer than gold and more precious." Caleb reached up with his good hand and cupped her face. "I love you too. You brought my life back from the dead. You made me remember what it means to hope, to build, to care about tomorrow. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, even if you did come to me through the strangest circumstances imaginable." They kissed, tender and deep, a reaffirmation of vows and commitment. The violence of the day faded into the background. What mattered was this: two people who'd found each other against impossible odds, who'd fought together and won, who'd built something real and lasting from the wreckage of their past lives. "Let's go. Home tomorrow," Eleanor said. "Back to our mountain, our land, our life." "Home," Caleb agreed. "That sounds perfect." And for the first time since Dalton had made his move, they both slept peacefully, knowing that the threat was gone and the future was theirs to shape. The seeds Eleanor had planted, both literal and metaphorical, had survived the storm. Now they could grow without fear, nurtured by love and protected by justice. 6 months passed, and spring returned to the Montana mountains. The snow that had blanketed the peaks through winter began its retreat, and the land awakened to new growth. Caleb's shoulder had healed well, though it ached sometimes when the weather changed, a permanent reminder of the day he'd stood between violence and the woman he loved. The homestead had transformed beyond anything Caleb could have imagined in those lonely years after Sarah's death. The fields that Eleanor had planted the previous year were being prepared for a new season, and this time they knew exactly what to do. Eleanor's father's catalogue was complete, a comprehensive guide to frontier agriculture that she'd finished over the winter months. It had been printed and distributed throughout the territory, with more copies being requested from settlements as far away as Wyoming and Idaho. Professor Hartwell's name, and Eleanor's beside it, would be remembered by generations of settlers who used their knowledge to make the harsh land flourish. But the most visible change wasn't in the fields. It was in Eleanor herself. She was visibly pregnant now, due to give birth in the summer. The pregnancy had been a source of both joy and fear. Caleb couldn't help but remember Sarah, couldn't help but worry. But Eleanor was strong and healthy, and the traveling doctor who checked on her regularly assured them both that everything was progressing normally. They'd built an addition to the cabin over the winter, expanding it into something more substantial. The room they'd prepared for the baby was bright and warm, with a window that looked out over the fields and mountains. Unlike the nursery Caleb had built for his first child, this one would be used. This time, hope would be fulfilled rather than shattered. Thomas Dalton's trial had concluded in February. He'd been found guilty on all counts and sentenced to 10 years in the territorial prison. His lands had been seized and redistributed to the families he'd defrauded. The revelation of his corruption had triggered a wave of reform in territorial governance, with federal oversight increased to prevent similar schemes. What had started as one man's attempt to possess one woman's knowledge had exposed systemic problems and led to meaningful change. On a warm April morning, Caleb and Eleanor sat on their expanded porch, drinking coffee and watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold. Eleanor's hand rested on her belly, feeling the baby move beneath her palm. "Your father would be proud of you," Caleb said, as he often did. "The catalog is reaching people across the territories. His life's work is helping families build better lives." Eleanor smiled, her hand finding Caleb's. "Our life's work now. We finished it together. Just like we're building this life together." The sound of wagons approaching drew their attention. It was Mrs. Henderson and several other women from the settlement, arriving for the quilting circle that had become a regular gathering at the stone homestead. The women had created a tradition of meeting every few weeks, working on projects together while sharing news and supporting each other. They were making a quilt for Eleanor's baby, each woman contributing a square that represented something meaningful: plants from Eleanor's gardens, mountains from the landscape they all shared, symbols of hope and community. "Morning, Eleanor, Caleb," Mrs. Henderson called out cheerfully. "Beautiful day for working on that quilt. Won't be long now, before your little one arrives." As the women settled in with their sewing and conversation, Caleb headed out to the fields, where several neighboring farmers were arriving for a working session. Eleanor had agreed to teach advanced companion planting techniques, and word had spread. Now, they came from all over the territory to learn from her. The homestead had become a center for agricultural innovation, exactly as Eleanor had dreamed when she and her father had traveled the frontier together. At midday, Eleanor joined the men in the fields, her pregnancy not slowing her down as much as Caleb worried it should. She moved among the planted beds, explaining the theory behind each arrangement, demonstrating techniques, answering questions with the patience and precision of a natural teacher. Watching her, Caleb felt his heart swell with pride and love. This remarkable woman, who'd come to him as a poker prize covered in dirt and fear, had become the center of a community, a teacher who changed lives, a partner who made everything better. That evening, after their visitors had departed and the sun was setting behind the mountains, Caleb and Eleanor walked through their fields together. The soil was dark and rich now, transformed by 2 years of careful tending. Green shoots were already emerging, promising another abundant harvest. "Do you remember that first morning?" Eleanor asked. "When you found me kneeling in your field? I thought you'd lost your mind," Caleb admitted with a smile. "A strange woman playing in the dirt at dawn." "I'd found hope," Eleanor said. "For the first time since my father died, I'd found something worth caring about. This land, this work, this purpose. And then I found you." They stopped at the spot where Eleanor had first knelt and examined the soil, the place where everything had changed. Caleb put his arm around her shoulders, careful of her rounded belly. "The whole saloon laughed at me that night," he said I'd won the worst bargain in Montana. They were wrong. I won the best thing that ever happened to me." Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder. "We won each other. Two people who'd lost everything, finding something worth building together." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they stood together, looking at what they'd created, not just the thriving fields and the expanded cabin, but the community, the knowledge shared, the lives changed. What had begun as a drunken poker wager had become a love story, an agricultural revolution, and a testament to the power of seeing people for who they truly are, rather than what circumstances have made them appear to be. Inside Eleanor, their child moved and kicked, eager for life. Around them, the land they'd nurtured together prepared for another season of growth. And above them, the Montana sky spread vast and beautiful, full of stars and possibility. The seeds Eleanor had planted were still growing, would keep growing long after this season and this harvest. They'd planted not just crops but hope, not just knowledge but community, not just a garden but a legacy. And in the summer, They would welcome a new life into the world they'd built. Together, a child who would grow up knowing that love can be found in unexpected places, that worthless things sometimes turn out to be priceless, and that the greatest blessings often come disguised as disasters. Caleb Stone had walked into that saloon thinking his life was over, that his best days were behind him. He'd been wrong. His best days had just begun, starting the moment he'd chosen kindness over cruelty, compassion over convenience, and seen the worth in a woman everyone else had dismissed. As they walked back to their cabin hand in hand, the future stretched before them, uncertain in its details, but certain in its foundation. They had each other, they had their land, they had their purpose, and they had their love. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything.